Hello, everyone. It's so great to be here. And Carme and Elizabeth, thank you very much for joining us. I'm sure this is not the first time you've heard it today, but we will go to audience questions, so please get them ready. Now, I want to start with what might seem like a very basic question, but an important one. The title of this session is, Can AI be governed? What does governance or governing mean to you within this context? And Carme, let's go to you first.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much. And as you say, it's not only can be governed, it must be governed. But I want to make a clear differentiation between what is ethics, governance, and regulation, because there are three different things. Ethics is how we should behave according to our principles or values, and that applies to the guidelines of companies, implementing services companies also, or users. But a total different thing is governance. Governance means what are the instruments we must put in place to ensure that corporations and governance are behaving ethically, because ethics is nice to have, but there is no rights that come from that, I would say, self-regulation or self-ethical guidelines. And regulation is one way to achieve governance, but it's not the only one. You can achieve governance through transparency, through monitoring tools, through market incentives. So that's why I want to make this differentiation.
And Elizabeth, the same question to you.
Well, I think you put it very well. I would just agree that I think we've achieved a huge amount through a lot of voluntary frameworks. You look at the work that the NIST AI risk management framework has done, being adopted by companies nationwide. You look at the work that we've done at the Safety Institute through voluntary commitments. I think this is so important as this technology is evolving so quickly. Mm-hmm. We need to be nimble and iterative, and a lot of these sort of frameworks enable that.
And you talked about the work that you've done at the Safety Institute. Now, I believe the Safety Institute only began this year. It was announced last year by Vice President Harris. You kicked off your work this year. Can you maybe explain to us one thing that you've achieved so far at the Institute that you're incredibly proud of, and one area where you feel there is still more to do?
Our job at the USAI Safety Institute is to identify and mitigate the risks of advanced AI systems so we can harness this breakthrough technology for all of the many positive use cases that it enables. And we do that through testing and evaluation, guidance, and what I consider ecosystem building. You asked what I'm proud of that we've achieved. We've already signed memorandums of understanding with OpenAI and Anthropic, and just completed our first round of testing of a pre-deployment model with Anthropic's upgraded Sonnet 3.5. This is really a classic example of how we're able to leverage the technical team that we've built, drawing from Berkeley, MIT, the big labs, to understand the risks and capabilities of these models and to leverage their tremendous expertise in national security across the US government.
And were there any surprises from those test results?
We'll have more to say soon, but I think in general, I'm just excited to continue to build this out, leveraging our colleagues, Department of Energy, at Department of Homeland Security, building on the President's recently released National Security Memorandum, which really positions us as the tip of the spear for the US government's work with the companies in testing these models prior to deployment. You asked what we still want to achieve. Mm-hmm. I think part of what we're really excited to do is make sure that the US is leading with substance and that we're helping advance the global conversation around what safety should look like. Both because we know that AI does not stop at borders. We all need to have shared best practices, aligned and interoperable evaluations to advance safety, but also to enable innovation. We're very aware that it's largely US companies that are developing the leading AI models, and we want to make sure we don't have a patchwork of regulations globally, but are instead marching in alignment so we can continue to unleash that breakthrough innovation.
And on the subject of shared knowledge, shared regulations, Carme, you have many, many job titles, as we heard in the introduction, but let's focus for a second on your role as the co-chair of the UN's Advisory Board on AI. Now, the board has recently developed guiding principles for international AI governments. These include the proposal of an international scientific panel on AI, a central AI office at the UN, a global AI fund. But one thing you did not recommend was the creation of an international agency for AI. Can you explain why you came to that decision?
Yes, as you know, this body was an initiative of the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, when they say, okay, what can we join, like whether 39 people, experts from the academia, private sector, policymakers all over the world, very representative, very diverse, to think about if there is a need or not need for a global governance of AI on top of the existing guidelines from the industry or even national or regional regulations. And the conclusion was that yes, we need a global governance because there is important global deficit in three main areas. One is a deficit of inclusiveness. Out of all international initiatives we have been naming, only 7 countries in the world are party of all, the G7 basically, but there are 118 countries in the world that are party of none. So they are not even sitting in the conversation about what are the limits, what are the safety guidelines, what are the ethical principles on development. They are not participating in discussion. Second, there is an important gap on accountability because there's a lack of transparency. This technology has not been developed by the academia that is obliged to publish everything, but it's developed on the R&D centers of private companies, which are not transparent. And this is why we need a scientific panel in the same way that the ICC panel was useful to climate change to agree on the state of the development, on the risk, and on the opportunities. And there's a deficit in implementation because if we really can benefit from the real advancement that AI means for humanity in terms of achieving huge advances in scientific research, in accessibility to education, in the achievement of SDGs, if we leave this ungoverned, we are not going to reap all these benefits because we are going to exacerbate the existing divides. And the reason why we have not recommended as an instrument international agency, because mostly international agencies refer to vertical domains. And this is a horizontal domain. So every single UN existing agency will have to revisit the role on the eyes of AI. We don't need to invent something about how is the implications of AI in defense, because we already have the Geneva Convention. Mm-hmm. We want to talk about intellectual property. We already have the WIPO. What it lacks is a coordination of these national, international efforts and this holistic view. And the problem is so important because it's not only affecting the safety in the frontier models of the future, it's affecting fundamental values and principles and human rights of the present. And this is why the problem is so important, is so huge that no single company, no single country can solve it all.
So you've made the recommendations. What happens now?
These recommendations that were on the sides of the UN General Assembly were adopted formally. Of course, the UN also issued a resolution prior to those recommendations. So there's important leadership for most of the countries on the UN system. And they were adopted in part of what we call the Digital Pact of the Future. Therefore, now the UN system is starting on the implementation of those recommendations that we expect to be implemented in less than 1 year time.
Less than 1 year's time?
Yes. I mean, any recommendation is as good as the implementation of that recommendation. If we are not able to make it in 1 year time at the path of innovation, they will become obsolete. So we will expect that at least the scientific panel, the policy dialogue, and probably the capacity building programs are set up in less than 1 year time.
Now, almost every panel today has touched on the election. We are not going to be any different. Elizabeth, before his re-election, President-elect Trump indicated that he would repeal Biden's executive order, which I know you were one of the key authors of, if he returned to the White House, because, and I'm paraphrasing here, he said it hinders innovation. What's your response to that?
So I would point out that I think there's multiple parts of the executive order that are focused on how do we enable innovation? How do we put more money towards R&D? How do we attract talent to the US that will help us continue to maintain our lead? How do we ensure this is a robust and competitive ecosystem where people have access to data, chips, other things that will ensure that we can really continue this going forward? And I think what's important to note is the work that we're doing at the Safety Institute, one, is very distinct from the EO, but two, is that we see it as part and parcel of enabling innovation. As the business leaders in this room know, when you have safety and governance that enables trust, which enables adoption, which ultimately enables innovation, and that we believe is the work that we are doing and what we think is so important.
So am I right in saying that you don't believe there's a tension between regulation and innovation?
I think that we are all keenly focused on getting the balance right. There should not be a tension between safety and innovation if we get it right, because we want to enable that trust, that adoption, ultimately that innovation. I think that all of us are incredibly excited by the tremendous potential of this technology. You touched on some of them, but as we think about new drug discovery and development, individualized education that could help address inequities in education, carbon capture and storage, new tools for agriculture, There's so many things that we all want to see unleashed, and as we see these models become more powerful, become more capable, we get that much closer to that future. And so we need to make sure that we're understanding the risks so we can unleash all those benefits as well.
And this is a question for either of you. What would worry you about the executive order being repealed, if anything?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, I mean, some countries, we use regulation as a tool for governance. I come from Europe, and I was a leading negotiator of the European AI Act, and that's a way to create certainty in the market, a way to put order in the market and generate trust for consumers and citizens. But I would say whatever works. There are other geographies that probably are more based on voluntary commitments, on codes of conduct. We are more prone on codes of practice. But at the end of the day, what we want is that these technologies are developed with responsibility, that we have accountability and different parts of accountability along the value chain. It's not the same accountability you put on the developer, on the implementation phase, or in the user. From the European perspective, we are not thinking that the European AI Act is something against innovation at all. In fact, we are introducing measures like real-time work testing as scenarios, sandboxes. But what I really think is that we are as concerned as the bad use of, I would say, misuse of technology, unintended misuse, but also the intended misuse of bad actors. And that involves either corporations or even governments. I mean, this is a very powerful tool that in the hands of authoritative regimes could really erode very basic principles. And this is why at a governance level, we don't pretend that the UN becomes a global regulator at all, but we think there is room for sitting at the same table, multi-stakeholder conversations, and agreeing on very basic things, that anything we do on AI at a global level needs to be under international law, UN Charter, and human rights.
I think that's very well put. These are dual-use foundation models. So even as we see incredibly exciting new developments in terms of assisting engineers with developing new code or enabling new breakthroughs, that also means that you could have the same models enabling more dangerous cyber attacks by a broader range of actors. So we need to be tracking those capabilities and those risks so we can harness the flip side.
I want to talk a bit about the AI divide, which I think Matt mentioned in his introduction. That, of course, refers to the uneven adoption of AI globally and how this can really deepen the global inequity that exists between high-income and low-income countries. Carme, let's go to you. Is this divide inevitable?
No, we have it already. I mean, it's not
so
inevitable.
So it is an inevitability. And okay, so how do we mitigate it?
Exactly. So it's already there because everything we have developed on AI is just based on data from the global north with computing capacities of the global north and the maximum talent we have.
So what's the UN doing to expand its data pool?
Okay, so first of all, for example, 100 of 10 computer centers, no, I would say high-performance computers that are in the world, there is no single one in the global south. Not in Latin America, not in Africa. So we want to really have equality on the benefits, we must ensure equality in the access. And ensuring equality in the access means access to data, and that means curated data which is representative of all the different diversity of the world. Also accessibility to computing power and skill development programs, so that we don't go to the global south with a techno-colonialism approach. This is a techno-social program. And then we need to be able to allow for development of new ecosystems, new entrepreneurial ecosystems that flourish in all the new global south. Because at the end of the day, just put it only from an economic perspective, all the big amount of money and investment that is being poured on this AI, I would say, sector can only pay back if there is a massive adoption, mainstream, globally. This cannot be supported only by the investment of companies in the US or in Europe. So at the end of the day, we are interested that these benefits get to everyone, but that's why we need to create these global development programs and capacity programs that we are encouraging from the United Nations, and also a global fund for AI devoted for development of those capacities, as well as the application of AI for the achievement of sustainable development goals. Because, I mean, it's not by chance that all these same countries of the global south that are lacking access to these technologies are also the same ones that have the biggest problems on sustainability. So there's two tensions go hand in hand.
And where are you hoping that the capital will come from for this global AI fund, which presumably is going to go on to fund, you mentioned the skills and development programs, for example. Where does the money come from in the first place?
Our proposal, and this can be inside the UN system or outside the UN system, we really don't care. We encourage to have a global fund for AI that includes contributions, public sector, development banks, but also private investors, philanthropy, and also contributions in money and in kind. It can be even more valuable than NVIDIA provides chips, or that some cloud providers free some capacity to provide those capacities to the global south, that money itself. So I think that's a proposal that needs to be developed in the following year also.
I think one of the really interesting things that shows up in the polling data is there's actually more optimism about AI in a lot of the global south than there is amongst the US population, because there's a recognition of all of the beneficial use cases and how game-changing that could be. And it's really incumbent on us to help realize those advantages. So certainly the work that you're doing at UN, the Secretary of State recently announced $100 million in commitments by all of the leading AI labs to make data, compute, others available to ensure that we're seeing this innovation across the globe. It's part of why the work we're doing at the Safety Institute and with the Safety Institute Network being launched next week in San Francisco is making sure that we have the global south at the table. Kenya is part of that network. We've got folks from South America and across multiple continents who will be at the table so we can help shape that future.
Yes.
Just building on that is very important, because I mean, with the exceptional role you are leading, Elizabeth, on gathering all the different national institutes, because there are things that we need to come to agreements. I mean, we cannot pretend that every country in the world has the same regulation, but we need to have a common alignment on this is not hampering the human rights, for example. But in the safety side, I mean, we need to agree a global framework for risk.
Certainly.
So risk that is in this country of the world, it must be the same risk in another country in the world, because we need to align international response for AI issues, safety issues. So these are the things that I think are needed to be discussed in the same table. And the UN has its flaws, but I think it has the mandate, it has the reach, and it has the legitimacy to discuss this governance issue at the global level.
I was saying to Elizabeth before we came on, obviously discussion, conversation is brilliant, but what's the next step? How do you ensure that that translates into concrete action that changes the game in the global south, for instance?
So I think what is both fortunate and challenging is that we are still so early in the conversation. AI is unusual in that it was the first breakthrough technologies in over 100 years we developed outside of government. It was private sector driven. And so I think governments are still moving very quickly to adapt to this new reality. We've seen laws like the EU AI Act passed. We've seen the UN resolution, but most countries are still figuring out what their regulatory frameworks will be, what their testing and evaluation will look like. And so I think by having these conversations early at the UN, through our network of AI safety institutes, we can help move towards both aligned and interoperable testing, but also shared best practices that'll inform that globally. I think the moment is really now, and the US was able to lead with substance here. If you look at the G7 commitments, they look very similar to the voluntary commitments made by 15 developers to the White House, and I think we continue to do that.
Are there any questions for Carme and Elizabeth? If so, please raise your hand and we will bring the mic to you. If not, I will continue because yes, have we got a question? Yes, brilliant. If you could just stand up, hello, say your name, where you're from before you ask your question.
Paula with Eurofins. We are traded on the French Stock Exchange, headquartered in Luxembourg, and in 62 countries. And AI is a tool that we would like to use, but we worry about IP infringement and confidentiality with the clients that we serve. And obviously in Europe, there's GDPR, and there's other aspects that could potentially more easily violate laws. And you mentioned it doesn't apply everywhere. So do you see a change in the regulation or regulations like GDPR as it relates to AI? A revision of such?
So as you say, the AI framework, for example, that we are using in Europe, which is the European AI Act, is an act. That means that applies to 27 countries at the same time. So the problem of competitiveness that sometimes we assign to Europe is not because of regulation, it's because of regulatory fragmentation. And we need a single digital market altogether to apply the same rules. And I think at the global level is the same. So the protection of data privacy is already covered in the GDPR, but for example, in the AI Act, we cover, as you mentioned, the issue on copyright, for example, so that we cannot infringe copyright in the training of the models. And for example, the right or the obligation to mark when something has been generated by generative AI. So probably I don't care, but I must know if that video is a real video, if that article is being produced. So I think that's a way to approach it. It's not the only one, but I think what we are all aware is that the development of AI is compatible, and I would say the competitiveness, and sometimes it is difficult to say it in the US, but I think competitive is not a question with regulation. We have like pharma companies who are highly regulated and very competitive and very profitable. So, and I would never take a pill without FDA approval. So the same happens. We pretend that really AI is becoming a transformational technology. It's not a technology, it's a meta-technology, because a technology that allows for the development of new technologies. So we may have some guarantees, I would say, the approach we follow in the UN is called meaningful openness. So there are two extremes. Totally openness, which makes no sense because you need to have, your secret sauce, which is a competitive advantage versus your competitor, and then a black box. So we really need to regulate these technologies based on the use case and ask for some public scrutiny and some external auditing in very particular use cases, especially the high-risk ones.
Anything you want to add, Elizabeth?
No, I would just add that I think AI is a great example of where there were sort of existing challenges that are exacerbated by AI. So for example, we do not have comprehensive privacy legislation in the US. I think people on both sides of the aisle have been calling that for a long time. And we know that AI both increases demand for people's data in a way that's harming to privacy, but also enables seemingly disparate pieces of information to be put together in a way that can be additionally damaging to privacy. So it sort of highlights the need for additional legislation in other areas.
Just with that, of course, the problems we have with data privacy are not new because of AI. They're already there. There are present issues that we're having platforms. Because at the end of the day, the reason why these private companies haven't capitalized the development of AI because they were already acting as monopolies in the access of data. So based on the supremacy of data access, this is the reason why this technology has not been developed in the academia. Not because academia didn't have the talent, not because the academia didn't have the money, because the academia didn't have access to the data. So based on the monopoly of data, you're building a sort of monopoly of AI. But this is not a problem of AI. It's a question of how the market is structured, because it's in concentrating power of very few companies in the US, few companies in China, and that's the situation we have today. So one of the challenges we have at the global level is to prevent this highly concentration of power, allowing for others to develop, because either we open the models, or we open the data, or we open access to technology and capacity.
And I'm going to finish with a quick fire question for each of you. Is there a country other than the US or a region other than Europe who you think has a particularly effective approach to AI governance at the moment? Elizabeth, we're going to come to you first. The answer may well be no.
So I think there's really interesting work being done technically in a lot of countries. So you look, for example, at the work happening in Singapore, where a quarter of all their graduates are computer scientists, and they just launched a multilingual evaluation bringing in the ASEAN countries. You look at the expertise that the British have built up. I think it's really inspiring as a public servant to see the number of people that are coming into government to help make sure that we are able to keep pace with this breakthrough technology. And those are two examples of countries where I think they've really prioritized that.
Great. Carme.
I think we can learn from each other. I think, for example, I don't like Chinese approach in many things, but for example, the Chinese, we must admit that they protect much better their children than we do in the access of technology. And for example, I think the challenge we have here is anything we do must be future-proof. So the way we structure regulation needs to foresee the fact that it needs to be iterating as long as technology evolves. So it's not a fixed photo, it's like an evolving photo thing, as long as we create mechanisms that work for keeping the path of technology, but giving certainties, because again, if I cannot trust what I see, what I read, or what I watch, I will not adopt it. And if I don't have clearly how this black box is constructed, or if the system still hallucinates, I'm not going to adopt it in my car industry or my pharmaceutical company. And that's why we need adoption, massive adoption. And I think that's why we need to build this trust based on technology and regulation and governance.
Carme and Elizabeth, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your time, and we'll watch closely to see what happens over the next 12 months.
Thank you.